Roxane Chartrand and Pascal Thériault. So, hi everyone. We come from University of Montreal, so that's why we speak French. So Pascal and I are very happy to be here today to talk about a subject that has been our common research for almost 2 years now. Our work on feminist alternative gaming practices go back to our founding of the group Feminist Videoludic at University of Montreal, which is a feminist and queer discussion space. And some of you might have heard our presentation at History of Games in Montreal last year, where we tried to define the all games movement, and that was kind of the first half of our project. Our presentation today is the second part of our work. We wanted to highlight the ways in which feminist, queer, and autobiographical gaming practices, and especially the all games movement, could be seen as part of a post-humanist movement that aims to recrystallize identity in a virtual space, thus getting rid of the physical imperatives of identity performativity. And so we'll seek to highlight the ways in which the all games are in line with post-humanist and transhumanist theories and could constitute a form of post-human being, a sort of mind-uploaded state of cyber being, drawing from Donna Haraway's concept of the cyborg, which poses the idea of a feminist and queer resistance within the space between the individual and the machine, as well as from Morton's idea of the cyberqueer and Wakesford's theorization of the cyberqueer identity especially. And so this multifaceted phenomenon offers a unique opportunity for the conceptualization of the self, aiming to imagine a post-human identity which transcends the physical norms and space to the benefit of individuals and groups who subvert the norms of cisgendered masculine heterosexuality. So we don't aim at offering a definition of what is post-humanism, or we don't claim to propose a model of what is the post-human being. We just draw from a variety of definitions, including works from Foucault, Wolff, Hales, and Bohlstrom. And we try to think of the ways in which videoludic creation is queer and accessible way to think about the post-human identity in its current form, or what we can do right now.
So it's been discussed before, so we won't insist too much on this, but it's an important premise to the all games movement. So video games culture is heavily tainted with militarized masculinity and has often been described as toxic by feminist game scholars such as Nia Consalvo. The state of this community, which is vastly harmful to women, people of color, and marginalized people, could be explained by the military and industrial origins of video games. What Klein called military masculinity is in fact a hegemonic discourse based around issues of war and combat, which ultimately resulted in evacuating marginalized people and diversity in video games to the benefit of similar content, primarily addressed to a white cis-het men audience. There are many incidents of harassment, violence, racism, and sexism in video game content and communities, partly caused by this militarized masculinity. In fact, that is either in game creation, player communities, or even in the games themselves, women and marginalized folks are not welcomed. And these are elements that highlight a systemic problem, according to Consalvo. However, there is an increasing feminist and queer resistance in both video games creation and gaming practices. Several creators and marginalized people are trying to reclaim the space by resorting to several political and technological tactics in order to set up direct social change. The all games movement appropriates video games conventions to create radically different objects from typical games. This creative process and appropriation tactics can be situated within the queer game paradigm, where games are conceived as a space within which players are allowed, in fact, to explore and subvert rules, thus shifting the focus from the content of game to their essence. Ultimately, queerness interrogates the notion of social norm and subvert them by being voluntarily countercultural. The queerness of game can be seen as a way to perform a virtual identity, to explore the notion of the self in a disembodied form where rules are defined by a computerized identity, which can be manipulated, and not by a physical one.
And so in 1984, Haraway publishes a Cyborg manifesto where she first theorizes and kind of overly cryptic and dense terms, the idea of the cyborg as a feminist utopia. Essentially, the cyborg identity can be summarized in 3 main points. So in this paragraph, she writes that, and usually I have it on my screen, but now I don't, a cyborg is a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality, as well as a creature of fiction. The cyborg is a matter of fiction and lived experiences that change what counts as women's experience in the late 20th century. This is a struggle over life and death, but the boundary between science fiction and social reality is an optical illusion. And so in this short paragraph, and as I said in a weird syntactic way, the author highlights 3 critical aspects of her idea of the cyborg. The first being that it is constituted of both organic and technological components. The second being that it blurs the boundaries between fiction and social reality, that she distinguishes it from biological reality. And the third one is actually the one we consider the most crucial, is that the cyborg defies both biological and social binary oppositions with regards to identity construction. Most importantly, Thériault's cyborg challenges the idea of white feminism, which focuses primarily on white heterosexual biological women. The cyborg as a utopian concept transcends sex, gender, and race, but also questions biological imperatives limiting identity construction. Similarly, Walmart argues that Thériault's cyborg also disrupts the gender power relations of technology, which have also reinforced the patriarchal order. But the main problem with Thériault's cyborg is that although it seems to offer a promising avenue to think about the intersection of sex, gender, and race at the crossroads of technological and biological functions, her work remains to this day, so almost 30 years later now, mostly conceptual. Indeed, Paradis argues that this embodied performance has faded in the face of the inescapable race, sex, and gender body, thus preventing Thériault's cyborg utopia from materializing. So faced with both the lingering technological difficulties associated with cyberware integration to the human body, as well as the inevitable reminders of heteronormativity, got it, in what cyberpunk literature calls the meat space, so the physical space, the idea of cyberqueer emerged. And so Tudor states that the cyberqueer is the ultimate manifestation of queer theory, as it is seen to transcend the physical world in a parallel space where one freely and flexibly can pick and choose who to be. The cyberqueer identity refers to individuals and groups who subvert heteronormativity by performing their identity as fluid, thus subverting binary social norms, and do so using the many possibilities brought by the democratization of the internet and the virtual world. Although cyberqueer movement is kind of loose, mainly characterized by the idea of queerness in a virtual space, Reappr identifies 4 main themes associated with cyberqueer research. The first one being identity and self-presentation, of queer folks. The second being the creation of a queer space. The third one is the electronic facilitation of a queer virtual community. And the fourth one is new technology and erotic practices. And so most of them in the 90s were about how VR will inevitably and irrevocably change the way we think about eroticism and erotic practices as a whole, because it was the 90s and VR was kind of like a utopian concept. But it's actually extended to sexuality in a virtual world in general as well.
So, the Allgame movement is a relatively recent phenomenon, and so we propose to use our partial definition which we offered last year at the History of Games in Montreal, mostly because not much research outside of our own addresses the Allgames directly. Although the label itself can and is used by many non-marginalized designers aiming to create radically different games, the Allgames community mostly unites marginalized people, which strongly links them to the idea of the cyberqueer, which we can trace back their origins to previous subversive practices in video games communities, such as the Scratchware Manifesto, the Real-Time Art Manifesto, and the Not Games movement that we talked about earlier. So from these historical predecessors, we define Allgames based on social networking discourse and game content by proposing that they exist at the intersection of 4 main components: artistic, economic, political, and ludic, where the Allgame label may be illustrated in one or all of these components. So for the artistic component, in fact, all games can often be seen as aesthetically distinct from mainstream indie or AAA games. In this respect, designers concerned with the artistic aspect aim to create works of art, and many will stray away from established convention in the video game world, such as photorealism. Aside from the visual aspects of aesthetic consideration, the idea of communicating a personal experience or an emotion sensation is often central to the experience of all games. The reflexive process is an integral part of some creator artistic approach. The artist and her experience are essential part of the game. And for the ludic component, most all games are also question traditional game mechanics and the idea of playing games themselves. The idea of games having to be fun, pleasant, or fulfilling experiences for the player is often questioned. Game mechanics themselves are often more accessible than traditional video games. Most games have simplified mechanics, which require few previous gaming experience to master, and the learning curve is reduced for very casual or new players.
The economic aspect mainly consists of the rejection of, I'm trying to find a way to go down in the notes without changing slides. Pascal, can you do it? And so it rejects traditional means of production and commercialization, distinguishing the all games from AAA and indie game. The end goal is not necessarily to sell your game at a high price, it's really creating a work of art, and if you can make money out of it, that's cool. A lot of game creators actually use platforms such as Patreon to get a salary. Well, you encourage the creator and not necessarily the games themselves within the all game movement. Another important aspect is the notion of accessibility of the means of production. For the patronage system to be sustainable, the financial investment on the part of the creators has to be somewhat reasonable. So here, free creation platforms are important. They mainly use open source, user-friendly platforms like Twine, Construct2, RunPy. These are most platforms that are used. And finally, the political aspect is probably the most crucial one to a sound definition of all games, since one could arguably state that all games are essentially political. Through artistic, ludic, and economic means, artists and creators question the established social and political order. All games are an act of resistance, whether or not the content of the games themselves are political. When observing the work of marginalized folks, specifically within the game design community, the idea of reclaiming the videoludic medium is also important, and so many all games creators are marginalized, both by the video game industry and society at large, and such. The content of a lot of these artists' games is explicitly political or aims at exploring political issues. And so we claim that all games could be seen as a part of a post-humanist movement that aims to recrystallize identity within a virtual space, in the sense that they are a way for queer creators to perform their identity in the virtual world without the imperatives of physical constraints and social norms. They blur the gender boundaries, erase binarity by performing fluid identity, and subvert heteronormativity through the internet by taking advantage of accessible means of distribution. They even thrive in forming communities of marginalized people who interact with each other, as Wakeford theorized, gaining a visibility never obtained before. So virtualized self-expression succeeds in transcending physical space, thus recrystallizing identity, which could ultimately eliminate physical imperatives of gender and identity performativity. But the all games movement is not a homogeneous one, and the same can be said about cyberqueer identities, whereas creators like Nina Freeman uses the Vignette format to literally code her memories into a virtual world. Others explore possibilities, emotions, and experiences in a distinctly ludic way, which doesn't necessarily conform to the idea of literally uploading one's mind into a computer. And so the virtual space and the game space are, in that sense, a scene in which a creator can truly play on the notion of identity itself in a ludic way. So we'll very quickly go through examples of game which highlight the ways in which cyberqueer identity can be materialized in its ludic form, because we don't have that much time left. So in Nina Freeman's game Sibel, the player plays as Nina's younger self, who is also playing an MMORPG.
The player has access to Nina's computer and personal files, such as emails and photos. And although most of the game is spent recreating the protagonist's choices in the fictional MMORPG, while performing typical MMO grinding, the player is also encouraged to go through these files and explore 19-year-old Nina's memories when he is offline, when the player is offline. So Cybele is an exploration of a fragment of Nina Freeman's memories, her virtual relationship of intimacy and eroticism in a virtual world. The boundaries between reality and fiction are doubly blurred. The game explores the creator's memories. Sorry, I can't see. The game explores the creator's memories via a virtual world, which is a representation of the one in which she herself has lived these experiences. Freeman has reproduced a virtual relational space within a gaming world as virtual as the one in which the player will experience her memories. The link between post-humanist philosophy and the idea of mind uploading in a video game is even clearer when Freeman openly plays with her own memories by adding old selfies in the game world. These can be akin to the idea of self-downloading, and we could also see this as a form of inverted cyborg, whereas Haraway's cyborg aimed for the inclusion of cyberware to the human body. Freeman includes an organic component within a technological body. The author recreates a fragment of her identity within a completely virtual space and goes beyond the bound of organic corporal reality by using the cybernetic components to reform herself as a virtual/real hybrid identity.
On the other hand, in Caristone's latest game, which is not out yet, The Earth is a Better Person Than Me, the idea of literal uploading one's memories into a game isn't as clear, in the sense that it doesn't seek to represent specific experiences, but it does deal with exploring one's identity, desires, and affordances in an abstract and ludic way. In the game, the player embodies Delphine, a young woman struggling with depressive symptoms who decides to go take a walk in the forest, as is often suggested to depressive people. The player can choose between and play a total of 6 paths, which are all conversations with elements of the forest which she stumbles onto, like a river, the moon, a tree, for example. And so the game is partly autobiographical and actually an expression of feelings, desires, and thoughts through a fictional dialogue with nature. Some of the paths actually deal with BDSM, consent, depression, suicide, obsessive behavior like hair pulling and skin picking, self-acceptance, body image, and self-love. But mostly it represents the hardships of self-exploration. In that sense, the game isn't a fixed cyber identity as much as Nina Freeman's was. Rather, it's an exploration of the eternal quest for purpose, meaning, and understanding of oneself inside a virtual world. And so, short conclusion, we argue that all games are part of the cyberqueer movement because they subvert social norms, mainly heteronormativity, through virtual means of expression and distribution that transcend physical space. They create communities where marginalized people can think and discuss their experiences. There are 2 ways in which the all games, and particularly autobiographical games, can form a post-human being. On one hand, creators can use video games and their ludic affordances to recrystallize their memories in game form, closer to the idea of mind uploading. We can think of Zoe Quinn's creation like Depression Quest, or Freeman's vignettes, which we presented one of them. And they present not only a virtualization of an experience, but also a blurring of boundaries between binary concepts such as gender identity, reality, and fiction, or the idea of self-realization. And on the other hand, creators can use games as a playground for identity exploration through ludic means, which is aligned with the idea of the queer identity as an ever-evolving and subversive quest. And so we'll conclude by insisting on the fact that we don't argue that making games makes you a literal cyborg, although I personally would like that. But what we do is argue that creating alternative games, just as Haraway argued in her manifesto, blurs the boundaries between fiction and reality, while also exploring the idea of the self outside physical constraints. In that sense, the cyborg here has to be seen as a conceptual entity, rather than a physical one, And so we use its ideological and utopian grounds as inspiration, basically, to think of the way that queer game creation can be a hybrid identity construction process. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I'd like to ask, okay, you start from Mona Haraway, and her point is to merge the worlds, to make the border between the worlds disappear. And you argue with her, which is okay. Actually, she develops that idea a bit further by her next nature, culture, ideas, and so on and so on. And then you're talking about creating special virtual worlds for special people, like to probably not delete the border, but create new borders. Is that a contradiction, or is it just me? Thank you.
Pascal, do you want to say something? Well, I was going to say that I don't see it that much as a contradiction, really. As we said, all games in particular are, like, everyone can make all games. You can decide tomorrow morning to make an all game and tag it as an all game, and it will be considered an all game. I have cis-het white men friends who do all games, and that's cool as well. I don't think that particular movement creates a barrier.
Because the all game is not it's not a homogeneous one. It's hard to define all games because it's ever evolving, and the goal of the all game is not to be defined in a fixed definition.
What we're saying is that it's basically, we don't see it as creating another barrier at all. We see it as, you know, moving the community from the physical space to a virtual one. But like, there's no true, like, separation. We don't say, like, okay, well, it's only for queer people, it's only for, you know, cyborg aspiring people either. It's really a free thing, and we use the concept of cyborg really as a conceptual tool in that case.
Hi. So the way you've set up cyberqueer in relation to all games, it sounds like it's fairly committed to a kind of Judith Butler queerness that is a performativity.
Thank you. And my concern is the extent to which that might be missing out. So there's a critique of Butler that it's missing out the embodiment, particularly from trans writers. So I'm wondering, because I know that there's a lot of interest in embodiment and interface in our games and kind of new controller designs and those sorts of things. How does that fit in with your assertion of all games as cyberqueer, if cyberqueer is committed to a Butlerian kind of queerness, if it is, which I might be putting in your mouth?
Yes and no. You put it because we didn't say it, but it is kind of strongly inspired by Judith Butler's work. So, like, it's fair that you do. Okay, so I think. I'm sorry, I kind of forgot what I wanted to say by saying that it was fine that you put words in my mouth. With the new interface options, I don't know if you have games in mind that kind of put back embodiment into the thing. I don't see it as a problem necessarily, because I don't necessarily agree with the whole Butlerian ideas. What I think is that maybe the cyberqueer movement can find a way to take back embodiment and interpret it or include it in a different way that would be based on the possibility to choose one's identity and embody it as they choose. I saw games recently that had, like, plants as interfaces that were really cool. I think it was either Squinky or Jess Marcotte. I don't remember who did that. And I thought it was really interesting because it shifted the focus back from purely virtual self to actually physically feeling something that had an impact in a virtual world. And I think both can really work together. So yeah, it is something that we're concerned with. We thought about it yesterday when we actually made the presentation, but it was like 10 p.m. and we were like, nah, let's just present this for now and work on it.
It's a work in progress too. It's not well, we worked on this for a while, but it's not a finite work.
Yeah.
So,
but thank you.
Yeah.
It's very important to highlight this.
Don't be shy. It's 2 minutes.
Hi.
Hello.
So I'm assuming that all games stands for alternative games.
Yeah.
And I think you made it quite clear in your presentation that these are games that are alternative to the traditional economic model of game production and also alternative to the traditional ludic structure of games. Mm-hmm. Can we also say that they are alternative to what we could call heterosexual white game design, or also alternative to the genre system, the game genre system?
I think so, but I think the hetero-white system is, well, deeply rooted in AAA industry. So I think it's not another it's not another category at all. It's kind of.
It's like a mashed up of everything. It's kind of all glued up together. We have, and a lot of our games are actually heavily inspired by traditional genres. You'll see a lot of like platformer all games, or we have, well, it's not necessarily a traditional genre, but walking sim all games, or that kind of stuff. So it's not really like they're not trying to like make like completely different experiences. It's still like heavily influenced by video games in general, but they're also aiming to subvert those norms. So they're really taking them back and then trying to switch the way we think about them. So it's a bit of both, I guess.
But really, really quick.
Baby quick, because we have to run.
Yeah, I'm not sure, maybe I've overheard it, but maybe it also ties into the question that was just asked. I was wondering how the idea of the alt game refers to this also like broad concept of independent games and art games, which are basically doing similar things. But I'm guessing the solution would be that independent art games are the art games made by white.
No.
Things like that? Or?
Not necessarily. So the way we define, so you have AAA games, which are like big industry, big companies. Independent games usually do games that they want to sell just like AAA companies, but without the imperatives of having big teams and, financial means. But they still want to sell their games on Steam and make money out of it for most of them. And then you have all of the alternative gaming scenes, which has alt games in it, but there are other movements as well, that are often one creator alone, or maybe 2-3 people that do that because they want to create a work of art, not really expecting to monetize it most of the time.
But sometimes indie games and alt games can overlap. For example, Nina Freeman is an alt game developer, but she also makes indie games with Fulbright, for example. So it's not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's just another whole system.
Yeah.
And that was all the time we have for the discussion.